Teddy Roosevelt lived a life of adventure, but one final wild expedition through the Amazon jungle would prove to be his downfall. After leaving office in 1797, George Washington retired to his plantation in Mount Vernon, Virginia. On December 12, 1799, while surveying his farm from horseback, the former first president exposed himself first to light snow and then rain. Washington refused to change his wet clothes. By the next morning, he was feeling unwell. His condition worsened, and doctors were eventually summoned who bled Washington and tried a variety of very iffy treatments. Nothing helped. On December 14, 1799, Washington died at age 67 with his family around him. According to the American surgeon, the cause of his death has been diagnosed as acute epiglottitis, but some think the treatments were the true cause.
If the disease itself didn't get George Washington, the doctors certainly did.
John Adams was long-lived, reaching age 90. In 1826, suffering from heart disease, his health began to fail, but he seemed driven to reach Independence Day. This allowed time for well-wishers to visit him and arrange for fireworks and cannons to salute him on July 4th. On July 4th, the former president awoke and heard the salutes. However, by the afternoon, he started to slip off. His last words?
Thomas Jefferson survives.
This was in reference to his old political frenemy, Thomas Jefferson. Yet unbeknownst to Adams, Jefferson had coincidentally died a few hours earlier on the same day. Thomas Jefferson died on the same day as John Adams on July 4, 1826, at his estate of Monticello in Virginia. Like Adams, Jefferson too was driven to live to Independence Day, although he had been suffering from a variety of health ailments for several years, including rheumatism and septicemia, which were treated with a mercury ointment that probably poisoned him. He also had other ailments, including kidney disease, infections, and possibly prostate cancer. All of this resulted in him retaining water and becoming bedridden on June 26, 1826. By July 2nd, he was mainly incoherent and only roused himself one last time on July 4th, before dying at about noon. James Madison, often credited as being the architect of the Constitution, served as president from 1809 to 1817. Madison spent his remaining years tending to his plantations, which were worked by enslaved people, and serving as a founding board member at the University of Virginia. In 1836, the former president's health took a turn. He suffered for months with chronic rheumatism and liver dysfunction, leading to his being confined to bed. Many hoped that he could make it to July 4th, but it was not to be. Death quietly took him on June 28th at the age of 85. James Monroe was the last of the Revolutionary War generation of presidents. He left the presidency in 1825, and 5 years later started to develop lung ailments which may have been tuberculosis. Finally, he succumbed at 73 years of age while visiting his daughter Maria in New York City on July 4, 1831. The third president to die on that historic date, he was buried in Richmond, Virginia. In his final days, Monroe also made one last request, to free his enslaved servant Peter Marks. This was apparently done posthumously, and Marks was the only enslaved person that Monroe ever legally freed. John Quincy Adams, the sixth president of the United States and the son of President John Adams, served from 1825 to 1829. After leaving office, he became the only former president to subsequently serve in the House of Representatives. It's also where he died. On February 21, 1848, Adams had just finished a debate when the 80-year-old suddenly suffered a massive stroke. Adams lingered for 2 days and was tended to at the Capitol. He finally died on February 23rd. On February 26, a large funeral was held for the former president, attended by his political friends and foes who all gushed praise for the statesman. Called Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson had suffered numerous wounds throughout his life, and according to history, even fended off a would-be assassin with his cane in 1835. But after leaving the presidency in 1837, he suffered from numerous maladies, including dropsy, chronic diarrhea, and tuberculosis. This all led to an unfortunate situation where Old Hickory retained lots of fluids. In 1845, doctors attempted surgery to drain fluids from his stomach. The operation was a failure, and although he lingered for some days, he finally died on June 8, 1845, at age 78. Martin Van Buren enjoyed a long spell of good health after the end of his presidency in 1841 in the comfort of his estate in his hometown of Kinderhook, New York. This lasted until 1861 when he was struck by pneumonia, then the next July by bronchial asthma. His health declined so rapidly that on July 24, 1862 at 2 a.m., he died of heart failure. He was 79 years old. Van Buren was given an 81-carriage service attended by the governor of New York and many locals. However, due to the raging Civil War, his death was treated as a footnote. William Henry Harrison was elected the 9th President of the United States in 1840. At the time of his inauguration on March 4, 1841, he was 68 years old, which made him the oldest president to assume office up to that time. His inauguration day was a cold and drizzly day, and Harrison did not wear any protective gear as he delivered an epic nearly 2-hour-long speech. The exposure to the elements developed into a cold, which apparently morphed into pneumonia, though some blame his demise on enteric fever brought about by contaminated drinking water. Either way, by early April he was confined to bed, and on the 4th day of that month he died, just 1 month into his term. By the time John Tyler died suddenly of a stroke in Richmond, Virginia on January 18, 1862, he was an outcast. As an obituary in the New York Times reported, he alone of the former presidents shifted his loyalty to the Confederacy during the Civil War. In fact, he had just been elected as a representative to the Confederate Congress. Though there was no official recognition of his death in the North, Tyler was given a lavish funeral in the South and buried with a Confederate flag. The New York Times, in its obituary, labeled him a traitor. This stigma may have contributed to Tyler's poor reputation among historians. There is one odd footnote. Despite being born in 1790, he still has a grandson alive today.
Talking about my grandfather being born in the 1700s, no, there's a disconnect there.
James K. Polk retired in 1849 after a single term in office. Mere months after leaving office, he contracted cholera while touring New Orleans. He died on July 15, 1849 at his home in Nashville, Tennessee at age 53. That's where things got weird.
The story of James K. Polk actually gets more complicated after his death.
The Washington Post reports that as per procedure with cholera cases at the time, his body was dumped into a mass grave. A year later, Polk's family disinterred the remains and moved them to a plot at the Polk Place grounds. But in 1893, the body was moved again after the property was sold. Yet another effort to move the body in 2017 failed, but who knows where it may end up next. July 4, 1850 proved to be a hot holiday in Washington, D.C., but President Zachary Taylor needed to take part in the groundbreaking ceremonies for the Washington Monument. To stave off the heat, Taylor drank copious amounts of iced buttermilk, ate plenty of raw vegetables, and gobbled down some fresh cherries. Shortly thereafter, the 65-year-old president came down with a severe case of diarrhea. He became bedridden and died on July 9, 1850. The cause of death was attributed to cholera, likely from something he ate. Still, rumors he had been poisoned persisted, since he was a forceful opponent of secession in the years leading up to the Civil War. In 2014, Taylor's body was exhumed and re-examined and showed no signs of arsenic poisoning.
At the final analysis, he had no more arsenic in him than you or I.
Millard Fillmore became president when Taylor died. Following his term, he failed to be elected in either 1852 or 1856 and retired to his mansion in Buffalo, New York. 2 decades later, on February 13, 1874, Fillmore suffered a stroke while shaving. While he managed to briefly recuperate, he was hit by a second stroke on February 26th. Incapacitated but still lucid, Fillmore died on March 8th at the age of 74. Though he was unpopular in the North for backing the reviled Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, he was honored by his native city as over 25,000 Buffaloans visited the coffin before he was buried in Forest Lawn Cemetery. Franklin Pierce was president in the years leading up to the U.S. Civil War and was subsequently blamed for not effectively preventing it. He was also a heavy drinker, which worsened after he left the presidency in 1857. His chronic alcoholism was made worse by the death of his wife and all 3 children from various causes. In July 1869, while at his cottage of Little Boar's Head in New Hampshire, the 64-year-old developed a swollen abdomen. He was confined to bed and lost so much weight that he slipped under 100 pounds. On October 8th, after months of suffering, he passed away, with the final cause of death believed to be cirrhosis of the liver. James Buchanan is ranked by U.S. News & World Report as being the worst U.S. president in history, primarily for allowing slavery to spread and failing to prevent the secession of the Confederate States, which triggered the Civil War. To try to rehabilitate his reputation after his presidency, Buchanan published a book called Mr. Buchanan's Administration on the Eve of the Rebellion, telling his side of the story, which blamed the war on abolitionists. It was a flop. The ex-president's health went into serious decline in 1868, with the 77-year-old Buchanan repeatedly remarking that he was looking forward to death. He died on June 1st of that year, likely from pneumonia. On April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was shot in the head by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The unconscious Lincoln was removed to the Peterson boarding house just across the street from the theater. Lincoln clung to life, though there was no hope. One of the doctors, Dr. Robert King Stone, would later state, "I at once informed those around that the case was a hopeless one, that his vital tenacity was very strong and he would resist as long as any man could, but that death certainly would soon close the scene." After an agonizing 9 hours, Lincoln died at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, surrounded by his physicians, friends, and family, and mourned by a grateful nation. Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, left the presidency in 1869 after a tumultuous term that included his impeachment. Johnson, however, began a political comeback and was elected to the Senate in 1875. He didn't have a chance to complete that comeback. On July 28, 1875, he suffered a stroke while visiting his daughter. The next day, he was hit by another massive stroke and died at the age of 66 on July 31st. Obituaries were not kind to the disgraced ex-president, and the verdict of history hasn't been much kinder. The post-presidential years of Ulysses S. Grant were tragic. After leaving office in 1877, he was swindled by his investment partner. To recoup the family fortunes in 1884, Grant began to pen his memoirs. During this time, however, he also developed a terrible pain in his throat, which turned out to be terminal throat cancer. Grant's throat eventually became so swollen and painful that he could not eat. The only thing that kept him alive was the drive to finish his memoirs. He completed the book on July 18, 1885, and died just 5 days later, having successfully secured his family's financial future. Upon leaving the presidency in 1881, Rutherford B. Hayes retired to his native Fremont, Ohio. There, he remained active in civic life, yet tragedy visited him within a few years. In 1889, Hayes was struck a heavy blow by the death of his beloved wife Lucy from several strokes. Hayes subsequently wrote, "The charm of life left me when Lucy died." Hayes would follow his wife 4 years later after contracting an illness on a drafty train. He used brandy to self-medicate and spent some time in bed, which improved his condition. However, on January 17, 1893, the 70-year-old was seized with a heart attack and died in his son's arms. James Garfield had one of the most agonizing deaths of any president. It started on July 2, 1881, when he was shot by an assassin. The cure turned out to be worse than the wound. Physicians, in trying to remove the bullet, used unwashed hands to probe the wound for the bullet, expanding the gash while not using any anesthetic.
They didn't know the exact track of the bullet. They couldn't tell how much damage it had done.
The wound became infected. Fever, chills, and indescribable pain racked the president as he wasted away from 210 to 130 pounds, while his organs stopped working. Tragically, on September 19, 1881, he died in terrible pain from a wound he could possibly have survived with better medical care. Chester A. Arthur finished up Garfield's abbreviated term in 1885, but 3 years earlier he had been diagnosed with Bright's disease, which affects the kidneys and was at the time incurable. The president kept this secret. Arthur also allowed himself to be considered for the presidency in 1884 by the Republican Party for a term in his own right, but he didn't really promote himself, knowing that he had a fatal illness and he lost the nomination. It was just as well that Arthur wasn't elected. His health grew increasingly unstable, and he ultimately died at age 57 at his home in New York City on November 18, 1886. Grover Cleveland is most known today for being the only president in American history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. Cleveland left office at the end of his second term in 1897, refusing to run for a third term. By 1908, Cleveland's health began to fail due to gastrointestinal disease compounded by kidney and heart issues. The ex-president, realizing that his days were growing short, had enough time to set his affairs in order. On June 23, 1908, he had a massive heart attack which rendered him mostly unconscious. He died the next day at the age of 71 with his wife Frances at his side. Benjamin Harrison, who first came to the presidency in 1889, was a grandson of the ill-fated 9th U.S. President William Henry Harrison and served as a Union general during the U.S. Civil War. Serving just one term, he retired from politics after losing the election in 1892 and moved to Indianapolis, where he practiced law. He married again at age 62 to his late first wife's niece and had a daughter, but in 1901 he developed a raging cold that turned into pneumonia. The illness grew so dire that by March 9th his case seemed hopeless. He slipped into unconsciousness and died on March 13th at age 67. The third president to die by an assassin's bullet was William McKinley. On September 6, 1901, he was visiting Buffalo, New York when he was shot in the chest by an anarchist. He was swiftly transported to a nearby hospital where he underwent surgery which seemed successful, to the point where his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, publicly predicted his recovery and went on vacation. However, it was not meant to be, and the 58-year-old McKinley took a turn for the worse as the wound became infected with gangrene. This led to blood poisoning, and the president died on September 14, 1901. Theodore Roosevelt was known for his adventuresome spirit, so after losing a bid for a third term in the election of 1912, Roosevelt decided to go on an expedition to the Amazon River basin in Brazil from 1913 to 1914. However, the expedition turned into a deadly fiasco, and the ex-president contracted malaria, becoming delirious with a high fever. His health never recovered from the rigors of the trip. In late 1918, he was hospitalized for inflammatory rheumatism. And on January 6, 1919, the 60-year-old died unexpectedly in his sleep at his home in Sagamore Hill on Long Island, New York. After serving as president from 1909 to 1913, William Howard Taft was appointed to the Supreme Court and eventually became the Chief Justice of the United States. Throughout his life, Taft struggled with maintaining a healthy weight. The Washington Post reported that at one point, while as president, his weight had risen to 332 pounds. During his later years, Taft had increasingly severe health episodes, such as high blood pressure. On February 3, 1930, the 72-year-old Taft formally retired from the Supreme Court. Suffering from heart disease, he died a month later on March 8, 1930. At the end of the First World War, President Woodrow Wilson was under considerable stress in his efforts to promote the Treaty of Versailles. On October 2, 1919, he suffered a massive stroke, leaving him with brain damage and partial paralysis. Remarkably, the White House managed to cover up the incident, with the First Lady Edith Wilson essentially running the government in his name.
She had a little table set up outside his bedroom where she'd meet with the cabinet members, and she would conduct business there.
Wilson left office in March 1921 and survived for another 3 years before dying in his sleep at the age of 67 on February 3, 1924. A century later, Wilson remains the only president who has been buried in Washington, D.C. President Warren G. Harding died while in office of a sudden heart attack during a tour of the country on August 2, 1923. The whirlwind tour of the nation took its toll on his health, and by the end of July, he began to suffer upper abdominal pain. Harding flubbed a speech in Alaska on the 27th, calling the state Nebraska, and needed to grasp his speaking lectern to keep himself balanced. At the end of the month, his temperature spiked to a dangerous 102 degrees. Harding was diagnosed with pneumonia and the tour was canceled. On August 2nd, his wife was reading a newspaper article to him when he suddenly died. He was 57. Calvin Coolidge was President of the United States during the heart of the 1920s, and the prosperity of the period led to him becoming highly popular. However, when his term ended in 1929, he chose not to run for office again. Instead, he retired to Northampton, Massachusetts, where he took to writing. Coolidge felt displaced in retirement. With the coming of the Great Depression, the federal government took unprecedented actions with the New Deal. Coolidge remarked, "I feel I no longer fit in with these times." On January 5, 1933, Coolidge was struck by a sudden heart attack and died at age 60. Herbert Hoover lived long after his presidency ended in 1933, reforging a reputation that had been tarnished because of the Great Depression. By 1960, when he was invited to speak at the Republican National Convention, he was regarded as an elder statesman.
Your reception is indeed a demonstration of great friendship.
However, by then, Hoover was growing quite ill. In his 80s, Hoover had grown almost completely deaf and blind and developed intestinal cancer. By the end of his life, he had also developed cirrhosis and suffered from internal bleeding. Finally, on October 20th, 1964, the 90-year-old Hoover fell into a coma with his 2 sons present. He died at 11:35 a.m. on the same day. In 1944, Franklin Delano Roosevelt won an unprecedented 4th term in office. However, his health deteriorated rapidly from the stress of guiding the nation through World War II. Not only did Roosevelt suffer from high blood pressure, but he also had heart and lung issues, including bronchitis. However, most of the public was unaware of these health concerns. Thus, it came as a surprise when he died on April 12, 1945. At the time, Roosevelt was sitting for a portrait at Warm Springs, Georgia, a place that had served as a retreat for the president for decades. The 63-year-old complained of a headache, then collapsed, dead from a sudden cerebral hemorrhage. After leaving the presidency in 1953, Harry Truman retired to Independence, Missouri, where he enjoyed good health until the mid-1960s. According to his obituary in the New York Times, in late 1972, Truman began to suffer from what seemed like minor lung congestion, but it was pneumonia, and unfortunately his body struggled to recover. Over the following weeks, his heartbeat grew more irregular, and by December 6, Truman's condition had become critical. Truman fought and recovered somewhat, but his health again worsened toward the end of the month, and the 88-year-old ex-president died on December 26th. Even while in office, Dwight Eisenhower suffered from heart problems. His first heart attack occurred on September 24, 1955 in Denver, Colorado. Despite the scare, Eisenhower was re-elected to a second term in 1956. After his time as president, Eisenhower's health issues were renewed. He suffered another heart attack in 1965 and then another in 1968. When his 4th and fatal heart attack hit on March 28, 1969, the 78-year-old ordered the doctors out of the room, leaving just his wife, son, and grandson behind. Just before dying, he took their hands and said, "I want to go. God take me." The assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy is one of the most infamous and terrible in modern U.S. history. On November 22, 1963, John F. Kennedy was in a motorcade in Dallas, seated in an open convertible when he was shot in the neck and head and killed. The assassination was officially attributed to lone gunman Lee Harvey Oswald, who was himself killed on live television 2 days after JFK's death. The Kennedy assassination has long been a favorite topic for conspiracy theorists. The conspiracies over who really shot JFK range from the Cubans to anti-Castro partisans to organized crime, with nothing ever proved. When Lyndon B. Johnson left the presidency in 1969, he was exhausted, not least because of the Vietnam War, which had dominated his presidency in the later years. Going into retirement, he reportedly said, "I'm going to enjoy the time I've got left." In retirement, Johnson gained an unhealthy amount of weight and took up cigarette smoking again, something he had given up 15 years earlier after a heart attack that nearly killed him. In April 1972, Johnson suffered another heart attack, which devastated his health. On January 22, 1973, he suffered a final fatal heart attack and died at the age of 64. Richard Nixon is the only president to have resigned from the presidency in disgrace. After his resignation in 1974, he went into seclusion for a while before making efforts to rehabilitate his image, but the stigma of scandal would haunt him for the rest of his life. In 1993, his wife, Pat, died. Nixon's health was also in decline until April 1994, when the 81-year-old former president suddenly suffered a massive stroke before dinner at his home in Park Ridge, New Jersey. He fell into a coma and died on April 22, 1994, with his 2 daughters by his side. After Gerald Ford took over the presidency in 1974 following Richard Nixon's resignation, he tried to win his own term in 1976. This effort failed, not least because Ford gave Nixon a controversial pardon, which was highly unpopular at the time. In 1977, Ford went into retirement. Ford had generally good health after the presidency and reached his 90s before he started to have any serious health issues. He died on December 26, 2006 at the age of 93 from arterial sclerosis. Ford was given a state funeral and laid to rest on the grounds of the Gerald R. Ford Museum in Grand Rapids, Michigan. After leaving office in 1989, Ronald Reagan retired to Bel Air, California. There he worked on his memoirs and led efforts to build his presidential library. However, the health of the president fell into decline, primarily due to Alzheimer's disease. In 1994, Reagan decided to make a public announcement about his illness, saying in part, "In opening our hearts, we hope this might promote greater awareness of this condition. Perhaps it will encourage a clearer understanding of the individuals and families who are affected by it." Reagan ultimately died at his home on June 5, 2004 at age 93. George H.W. Bush left office after one term in 1993 and promptly retired. Remaining active in voluntary activities as well as his presidential library, the Miller Center explains that he split his time between his family home in Houston, Texas, and Kennebunkport, Maine. Bush had a long post-presidency in which he fought various health issues, but what seemed to put fatal stress on him was the death of his wife Barbara in 2018. The Washington Post reported that Bush was hospitalized just one day after his late wife's funeral for blood infections. Bush was also battling Parkinson's disease, which had caused him to use a wheelchair. 8 months after the death of Barbara, on November 30, 2018, he died in his Houston home.